Alright, hey guys, welcome to the channel. Today we're taking a look at two premier models from the Rolex lineup, both with Serichrome bezels, both very sought after and hard to get, and both coming on the Oyster bracelet. So on the left side here we have the Rolex Submariner date, 41mm. This is a 2020 release. And then on the right here we have the Rolex BLNR 126710, the GMT-Master II, the Batman, which is a 2021 release back on the Oyster bracelet here. So two very different watches in terms of functionality. You know, the Submariner is obviously a dive watch, water resistant to 300 meters. And the GMT-Master II is a travel dual time watch, water resistant to 100 meters. But we're gonna go ahead and take a look at some of the similarities and the differences between these two very popular sports models or professional models in the Rolex lineup. So let's start with the Submariner here on the left. So the Submariner, this model came out again in 2020. This watch retails for $10,100. The secondary market is around $15,000. As far as the dimensions are concerned, this watch weighs 155 grams. The diameter, it's listed at 41 millimeters, but realistically it's really around 40.5 millimeters. The lug width of this watch is 21 millimeters, and it tapers down to 15 millimeters at the clasp. 12.4 millimeters thick and 48.2 millimeters lug to lug, including these protruding end links. It comes out to 51 millimeters. Something that's very useful on this watch is the adjustable glide lock clasp, which gives you 20 millimeters of on-the-fly adjustability in 2mm increments. So it's extremely convenient from a sizing standpoint. You can really get that customized fit that you're looking for. All brushed bracelet versus the polished center links on the GMT-Master II. This entire watch is pretty much brushed except for the flanks on the case and then the flanks on the bracelet, as well as the internal milling on the clasp. This watch runs Rolex caliber 3235, which is their latest generation of the 3200 movement series, which has a date, and they bumped up the power reserve to 70 hours. It also contains Rolex's Paraflex shock absorbers, as well as a silicone hairspring, so very shock and magnetic resistant movement here. The very first Rolex Submariner came out in 1954, obviously without the date function. The date Submariner came out in the 60s with reference 1680. You can see that there is a black lacquer dial, which is very deep black and very shiny and extremely legible and easy to read against the indices, as well as the hands, which are all filled with Rolex's Chromolite lume, which is extremely legible and glows in a beautiful blue color and is very long lasting. The indices and hands themselves are actually finished off with 18 karat white gold, so it makes them very tarnish resistant and very fade resistant over time. This watch has a 120 click Serichrome ceramic bezel. Extremely easy to turn, some of the best grip on a dive watch in the biz. Absolutely no backplay in between positions and locks in very easily. Very easy to turn and very audible sound. You can see this watch also has a lume pip to help you time your dives and elapsed time, and throughout the course of your day this can also help you time things like cooking or how much time has elapsed since you parked your car and so forth. In the inlays of the bezel, these are actually platinum inserts, so all these numerics are filled with platinum to make the watch overall a lot more tarnish resistant over time. The crystal is a sapphire crystal, very scratch resistant. This watch also features the classic Cyclops date magnifier on the crystal as well, with 2.5 times magnification, and definitely makes the date a little bit more legible and easier to read at a glance. However, it is a little hard to look at the date from certain angles due to the distortion on that Cyclops. And of course, this watch is 300 meters water resistant and is a proper dive watch. This is the maxi case. Since Rolex bumped up this watch to 41 millimeters, they actually increased the width of the bracelet to 21 millimeters, and they also increased the diameter of the watch, but they actually skinnied down the lugs so that the maxi case is no longer as prominent as it used to be. Lugs are definitely a lot more tapered and more reminiscent of the older Submariners, the pre-ceramic subs to be fair, and I think it makes the watch look a lot more balanced. And on wrist, I think this watch presents itself very well. I have noticed that because of the increased diameter, there's a little bit more overhang on the wrist because of those protruding end links as well. I have a 6.5-inch wrist, and I've noticed that it has a little bit more wrist span. I actually kind of prefer the 40mm case just because I personally have smaller wrists, so that one hugged my wrist a little bit better. Also had a 20mm bracelet, so that definitely wore a little bit lighter, a little bit smaller. So kind of pros and cons to each model, but I think Rolex definitely got it right with this iteration overall. The Rolex GMT-Master, of course, was originally released in 1954, and then the GMT-Master II came out at a later date. This is the Rolex GMT-Master II, the black and blue, nicknamed the Batman due to the black and blue bezel. And as I mentioned earlier, this model came out in 2021. It's essentially the same as the 2018 release of this watch, which was the Batgirl featured on the Jubilee bracelet, or the Bruce Wayne as some like to call it. This is the exact same watch head and movement as that Batgirl, same exact caliber, the caliber 3285, which is a newer generation GMT movement with 70 hours of power reserve. And the first ever Batman, of course, came out in 2013, which was featured on the Oyster bracelet, but had the older caliber 3186. One could call this the Batman Returns, because this is the return of the GMT-Master II black blue on the Oyster bracelet with the new and improved caliber. So I think Rolex got it right with this release. Now this watch retails for $10,550. On the secondary market, it can trade upwards of $18K and above. So the secondary market price is a little bit higher than the Submariner. If that matters to you, that's definitely, to a lot of collectors, that is a factor. For me, I personally like to go with the watch that I enjoy more, but that is something to consider. So this is a little bit smaller than the Rolex Submariner. It's going to wear smaller. It's lighter. It's at 140 grams versus 155 grams on the Rolex Submariner. It's a thinner watch. It only comes in at 12.1 millimeters thick versus the 12.4 on the Rolex Submariner. It's 40 millimeters in diameter. It's 48.1 millimeters lug to lug. There is some slight protrusion on the end links as well, bringing it up to 51 millimeters. So actually the wrist span is going to be the same as the Submariner. However, the lug width is 20 millimeters here versus the 21 on the Sub, and tapers down to 16. So the bracelet is a lot more tapered and has less of a stance on your wrist, and is a little bit more wearable. You'll see that this watch has, of course, the polished center links, which will scratch, which will fingerprint a lot easier than the brushed finishing on the Rolex Submariner. As you can see, this has a bicolor ceramic bezel, so the black blue. It's a very nice stark contrast. It's very easy to delineate between nighttime and daytime with this black and blue. It really makes sense. And this watch also has chromolite applied to all the indices, and the indices are also finished in 18 karat white gold. As you can see, this watch also features the Cyclops magnifier over the date, which I think the date is definitely having a date is very essential on a GMT watch. As you're traveling and traversing multiple time zones, it's nice to be able to have the local date and then also have the reference time using your GMT hand. The bezel is bi-directional and is 24 click. It makes it very easy to find the specific hour of your reference time or port city, and is very easy to grip and turn, just like on the Rolex Submariner. Very nice knurling on both of these bezels. It's not a very audible bezel versus the Submariner. It's very quiet and silent in its operation. So barely audible versus the Submariner, which has extremely audible clicks. Much more resounding and audible clicks, which makes sense on a dive watch. You definitely want to be able to hear the clicks. This watch does not have the glide lock system, but it does have a on-the-fly easy link system, which gives you 5 millimeters, which is basically one sizable link of on-the-fly adjustability. Because this watch is lighter, I think there's no need to have such a big clasp. It'll just bulk up the watch, and you don't necessarily need that level of adjustability on a lighter and smaller wearing watch. But that's just my take on it. On my 6.5-inch wrist, you can see that wears very well. Because of the smaller diameter of this watch, it at least appears like it overhangs on the wrist a little bit less than the Submariner, even though the dimensions of the lug to lug are the same. On my thinner wrist, I think this wears a little bit better for me personally, and it is a lighter watch, 15 grams lighter. You give up a little water resistance, but you really gain a lot of wearability day to day, in my humble opinion. The blue really looks darker in certain lights, and I think the blue is a little bit closer in color scheme to the black. This watch has some visual appearance, at least to some degree, of being a monochromatic all black watch with a little pop of color, which I really appreciate. The Submariner, of course, is all black, which does make it a little bit more versatile. It can go a little under the radar better than the GMT-Master II. And then also due to the fact that the GMT-Master II has a little bit more of a pop visually as far as the numerals are concerned around the bezel, I think it definitely is a little bit more eye-catching and stands out to a higher degree versus the numerals around the bezel on the Submariner. Final thoughts, I think they're both great. If you're looking for a watch that is a little bit more rugged and a little bit more, has more of a tool watch aesthetic, going back to the original roots, I think the Submariner definitely would check that box for you. But if you're looking for a watch that is a little bit more of, kind of Rolex's modern take on an old classic, I would say the GMT-Master II is a great choice and is not just a direct take on an older GMT Master, kind of like the Pepsi sort of represents in Rolex's lineup. It's definitely sort of just a purely modern take on an old classic. Between these two models, let me know which one you guys would prefer and why. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the comment box below. Hope you have an amazing new year. Thank you and take care.